And we're going to start on the dot of 12, no matter.
All right, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to everybody for joining us today on this call. We are going to be talking about strategic thinking in uncertain times, and we are extremely grateful to Frank Abdale from Abdale Consulting LLC. His bio was shared through the invitation today. So we, he has an extensive background, and we're so grateful to have him. He has helped us with other trainings in the past on strategic planning and succession planning, and so we're grateful for him to provide this session today as we try to navigate these unprecedented waters, so to speak. So I'm going to turn it over to Frank.
Hi. Well, thank you, Maggie. Welcome. Hi, everybody. As Maggie mentioned, my bio went out with the invite, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. But I would like to jump in and just take a look at what we want to accomplish today. So we want to start out by, we want to share lessons learned from weathering past crises and how that can help us with today's situation. We're going to talk about identifying techniques for prioritizing in the current crisis. We're going to discuss how to approach strategic planning and future visioning in the midst of a crisis. And we're going to share a handful of resources. And we'll circle back at the end to see how we did. So to jump in, Maggie, do you want to just make a couple of comments about how we're going to manage the conversation part of today?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some features that are available on this webinar. In the bottom, you'll see the option for chat. Please note that when you send it, when you pull up the chat button, you'll see that there's a to area. If you want it to just come to Frank and myself, you'll want it to say all panelists. But if you are okay with it going to everybody, you can say all panelists and attendees. So feel free to use that as a way to ask questions, maybe more technical, or if Frank is, he might put out some questions and I can read those off. You can also use the Q&A box. That's more for maybe content related questions, which we'll try to tackle towards the end of the today's webinar. And there will be a point too where Frank will open up the floor, so you can either ask your questions through or answer his questions through chat. You also can use the raise your hand feature. So if you look at your screen, you should see it. Raise your hand, and I will try to answer those as quickly as possible in the order that people raise their hands. So at that point, I'll turn your mic. I'll offer to turn your mic on, and then you can you'll be able to speak. And then once you're done, I'll turn the mic back off, and you'll go back as a participant. So if any questions along the way, as I said, just use the webinar chat.
Okay, great. So just to start us off, this is called strategic thinking in uncertain times. And to talk about uncertain times is to assume or to that there's such a thing as certain times, and which is really quite an illusion when you think about it, because if you look back to just the middle of January or last year when you were developing your budgets, nobody could have predicted what life looks like today. Which is why it's always helpful to have plans in place, whether they're emergency succession plans, emergency disaster preparedness, strategic plans, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But certainly nobody could have foreseen COVID-19. Absolutely not. Well, actually, that's not true. There are a couple of people, including Bill Gates, who were predicting a worldwide pandemic. But they were sort of voices in the wilderness going back at least a couple of years ago. But when we talk about crisis, we're really talking about change. And we all know that change is hard. But in this situation, we're not just talking about any kind of change. We really are talking about change on a massive, unprecedented global scale. And I think that the impact of this pandemic is going to reverberate for generations to come. And for us to avoid feeling overwhelmed, it can be helpful to understand first, how do we deal with change individually and collectively as a person, as an organization, as a family, as a community. That self-knowledge is really important because it helps us from reacting from a knee-jerk place and helps us to move past our own personal stuff and into thinking about what's the best way to respond to a situation like that. And also challenging now, I think, is that, you know, many of our default responses to dealing with change may not be available to us. So for example, I share this image not to make light of the situation, but to illustrate how overwhelming it can feel right now when the places we ordinarily turn to for support and comfort are no longer available to us. And it also doesn't help to, it does help, I think, to hold on to our sense of humor because it can offer us perspective, even in the darkest times. But it can also help to take a look back at another time in our lives when we went through a crisis, whether it was personal or professional, and came out the other side. You know, what got us through that? What did you learn from that? This is a question in the invite to today we asked people to think about in advance. So we'd like to open it up right now for maybe about 15 minutes to invite people to share with everyone what is it that you maybe learned, or what was it that helped you get through a crisis? So Maggie, we're going to open this up then for conversation.
Great. So as mentioned, you can either put your questions into the chat or you can raise your hand. Oh, we have John Farkas is looking to speak. Let me get that turned on. Oh, never mind. He decided not to raise his hand.
Okay.
But yes, you can raise your hand. He was testing the raise the hand. If you can raise your hand or use the chat. And again, if you want to just repeat your question, Frank, so they can.
Sure. What is it, if you think back to another time in your life, whether personal or professional, when you went through a crisis? And what was it that helped you get through that? What was it that got you through to the other side of it? And what did you learn from that experience that may be helpful in dealing with the crisis today?
So Sharon McCrone has commented in the chat that it's tenacity and group thinking.
Great.
Ryan Jennings says exercise, family and friend support, reading, and lots of lists.
Lots of lists?
Yes, lots of lists. Yep. And Wayne Stump says personal crisis, family, and what things that he's learned is communication, communication, communication. Maureen Maher-Gray says resiliency. And Ann Williams says support of family and friends. I learned that for me, everything happens for a reason. Maria Wilson says setting markers for future goals and family. Amber Loomis said this whole experience has forced me to slow down and take a beat.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's forcing all of us to do that in some ways.
Right. Ed Kopko says maybe,
especially if you're sort of a type A person used to leading and used to being involved on a day-to-day basis, it can be hard to slow down. What do you do with that extra time? It can be a challenge.
Absolutely. Peg Kopko says make the best decision at the time and move forward and remain flexible. Aurora says having a sense of humor, communicating, and transparency with staff and stakeholders. And Susan Hennemuth says keeping a schedule.
That's a great point, I think, is the working from home is a challenge. And I think it's been, for myself, it's certainly been helpful to keep to regular routines. You know, even if it's just, you know, making sure that the bed gets made and, you know, that I get dressed for work, even though I'm sitting at home and I'm sitting, you know, no one can see me except today when I put a good shade on. shirt on. But getting dressed for work is helpful, keeping to routines. Great point. All of these are great points.
Yeah, and Laurel says, gaining knowledge and understanding of local resources that can help.
Mm.
Roar also comments being flexible, giving staff the chance to express themselves and make sure everybody understands it's okay not to be as productive while working from home. And Linda says, stay focused and not to get distracted. I think that's a challenge, especially working from home, I think, when we have other things that are pulling at our attention, right, Frank?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And for someone like myself who's a consultant who works from home a lot of the time, that's not just a challenge today. You know, when you work from home and you're sitting at your desk, there's always that call, you know, to maybe I'll start that soup now, or you know, I'll take the dog out, I think. You know, so being able to learn how to work from home can be a big challenge.
Cindy Kennedy says, engaging everyone in your team to become innovative and flexible to meet the needs of both staff and patients, communication key, and celebrating the small milestones. And Elizabeth Burkhauser says, pushing through great disappointment and anger to see that I could successfully retool myself and then enjoy the benefits of the new position. I would never change back now.
Actually, could you read that again? There was a lot in there.
Sure, absolutely. So she says, pushing through great disappointment and anger to see that I could successfully retool myself and then enjoying the benefits of the new position, that she would never change back now.
Okay.
And I think we are all changed, right?
What's that, Maggie? Sorry.
I said, I think we are all changed now. I think we, you know, I think this is kind of going to be a milestone changing point. I think, you know, they talked a lot about pre 9/11 and post 9/11. And I think we're going to have a pre-COVID time and a post-COVID time, and it's going to change the way we do some things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think this will become a new marker for all of us, pre-COVID and post-COVID. And I like that you mentioned managing through, pushing through, I think is what you said, disappointment and anger, because those are not always feelings that we may feel like we have a right to have. And acknowledging the darker side of our feelings in this is really helpful, I think, rather than trying to bury them and move on nonetheless. Taking a moment, that slowing down, and maybe spending some of that slowing down time to acknowledge what's really going on with us all, not just professionally, but personally, can be very helpful.
So that's all the responses we've received to this point.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. There's a lot there. Certainly some of the themes about communication and support, finding support, and in lots of different ways, whether it's exercising or understanding what resources are available to us, staying flexible. I think that's really important because things change every day. Maggie and I were talking this morning that, you know, messages we got yesterday are different from the ones we're getting today and could be different from what we're getting tomorrow. So, you know, staying flexible can be a challenge. Staying transparent, that tenacity, I think was the first comment we got, was also helpful, which all of this ties into what Maureen mentioned about resiliency and, you know, looking to be as resilient as possible as individuals and as organizations today. It can be really challenging, particularly when we're looking at leading in a crisis. You know, leading is hard at any time. Being a leader is a challenging place to be, but leading in a crisis can be particularly challenging. But some of the things that we might consider is, everyone's familiar with this, I think, that, you know, when you're on a plane and the flight attendant tells us that if there is an issue, if there is a crisis, to put our mask on first and to take care of ourselves first so in order to be able to take care of others. So I think being, someone mentioned just before about exercise and about setting goals, you know, things that take care of ourselves, and then taking care of others. And someone else mentioned just before about taking care of the people that you're responsible for. Making sure that you're communicating, that you're being honest, that we're being transparent and compassionate. Monitoring morale. How are people doing? How are they dealing with this? And I think it's important to take particular care to support the people who are extroverts naturally and maybe living alone. I think those in my experience right now with family and friends, those are the people I see struggling the hardest right now, are people who are used to being regenerated by being outside and being external and interacting with other people. Introverts may be having a slightly easier time, but knowing your people and taking care of them is a critical first step, and taking care of yourself. Where's your self-care in this? How are you taking care of yourself? Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually? What are you doing? Where's your self-care time in this? Because as leaders, we can tend to take care of other people first and us last. Also looking at a crisis and looking at where's the opportunity here? Are there opportunities here? I love this quote that we never let a serious crisis go to waste. That there's always an opportunity to do things you didn't think you could do. I mean, how many folks are stepping up in ways that they may not have imagined that they had the courage, the ability to handle what they're having to handle today. And one of the challenges in leading is that while a crisis can bring opportunities, it also brings us an opportunity to think about how to operate differently and still effectively. But one of the greatest challenges is that there's all these things that clamor for our attention. And how do we deal with that? How do we set priorities? One of the things that I find helpful is to don't confuse the urgent with the important, and to understand what the difference is here. So for example, urgent is something that requires or demands immediate attention or immediate action. And that can often be the loudest noise. But where does that measure up against what's important? And the important things are those that contribute to our long-term mission, our vision, our values, and our goals. A tool that I find helpful is what's called the Eisenhower principle, which is a way to look at and evaluate. This comes from Dwight D. Eisenhower, and this is something that he articulated as a way that he managed not only being a general who led the Allies in World War II, but also as President of the United States. This was his time management tool. And assessing a situation and a call for action and determining first, is it important? Does it address our long-term mission, vision, values, and goals? As well as being urgent, something that requires immediate action or attention. Is it both those things? And that's the first thing to deal with. Secondly, we have those things that are important to deal with, but not particularly urgent. But generally, if something is important and we're not addressing it, it will eventually become urgent. And then third, it's urgent, but it's not important. And often that's the thing that's making the most noise and can be the most distracting. And then finally, to assess whether something is actually neither important nor urgent. And this is why I think we have a delete button. This is, okay, not important, not urgent. Let me move this out of the way and come back to focus on what is important and what is urgent. This is another tool that came out recently. It's a monograph called Tough Times Call for Tough Action. And it comes from a group called Sea Change Capital Partners. And it's a decision-making framework that they're offering. It's not necessarily something that I fully endorse. Actually, as I was reading it, I thought, I'm not sure about this, that, but overall, but it offered a really good framework by looking at what kind of an organization are you in the midst of this. So there are organizations, the way they break it out is that some of us are hibernators, which means that we're really completely unable to operate or largely unable to operate in the midst of this crisis. And some of their advice is about hunkering down and cutting cost and trying to weather this. The next group of organizations are the responders. And these are you folks who are likely experiencing an increase in demand for services. And the challenges here are keeping up with that demand and finding the money that it's going to take to support that increase for demand. And people are getting very, very creative. Actually, I talked to a friend the other day who works for the largest food bank in Detroit, and which is an area massively impacted. And they're doing incredibly creative things with mobile pantries and home deliveries, things that they hadn't thought of doing before, but now they need to do. And they're mobilizing a whole community around how to address the increase in demand. So people are getting creative everywhere. And then there's the hybrids. These are organizations that can offer programs, some programs, not all your programs. Some of your programs might be hibernator programs, and some of them might be responder programs. So deciding which of those programs within your organization to dedicate your efforts toward. A link to this is going to be offered later on. There's a list of resources that we're going to share, and a link to this monograph is included there. And finally, not finally, but a third way to think about how to move through this is looking at strategic planning. And actually, Maggie and I, we first were talking about this. We were talking about calling this strategic planning in uncertain times. And we thought that if you don't have a strategic plan in place, now's not the time to tell you that you should be doing something more than you're already doing. It's an overwhelming time to begin with. But we're going to look at what you might do if you have a plan in place and what you might do if you don't have a plan in place, and how to prepare yourself when you come out the other side of this with information that will support the development of a strategic plan. So if you have a plan in place, some of the things that you might consider doing are, keep your eye on the prize. That, ideally a strategic plan has identified your organization's North Star, that place in the future, that place in the distance, that all of your efforts are geared towards and coalesce around reaching that point in the future. So what is the larger vision that guides you? And importantly, what are the values that drive you? I think holding to our values in the midst of a crisis can really help us make the wisest decisions. What is it that guides us? What drives us? And then we can look at the goals and objectives in our plan, and you could view them through the urgent, important lens, and maybe think about how to prioritize some of the shorter term goals. And they can be given the impact of the situation right now, but they still can align you with that larger vision. Just rethinking it. You can also conduct some scenario planning to project some likely changes. Now, we know that the funding situation is going to change dramatically. It has changed and will continue to be dramatically changed. The government funding, who knows what's going to happen with that. It was never enough to pay for everything. There was always a need to supplement it to some degree. And it can be helpful if you look ahead to think about, well, what if we lost 30% of our funding? What would our program look like then? What would our staffing look like? What would our overhead look like? What if we lost 60% of our funding? That's really dramatic. And one of the resources that we're going to share in the resource list is a link to Nonprofit Finance Fund has put together a number of tools to help you think about cash flow scenarios, budget modification scenarios, based on if we lose this percentage, that percentage. And also, Maggie, Scranton Area Community Foundation is offering a finance webinar next Friday. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So it's actually going to be a little bit more of a workshop. It's going to be an extended type of training. And so we're going to hope to get those details out either later today or early Monday. But it's going to be a couple-hour financial management during a crisis to kind of help assess the financial aspects of managing a crisis.
Great, great. So for those folks who mentioned earlier about staying flexible, this could be a great tool, and also thinking about what's the impact going to be, and how are we going to respond to this? How are we going to continue? And then finally, you can consider alternate goals and objectives based on possible changes. There could be a shift in your mission based on this. You could be looking at a complete or partial shutdown of your organization, which could lead you to think about maybe mergers and acquisitions. The Sea Change Capital Partners that I mentioned earlier, who have that monograph, Tough Actions in Tough Times, they do funding for mergers and acquisitions, and they have a lot of resources around that, something to look at. And what other dramatic changes are you experiencing? So these are all things that you might do if you have a plan already in place. And when we get to the Q&A, if people have things they would like to share about how they're modifying their strategic plan at the moment, that would be helpful to hear. We'd like to hear from folks on the call today. And then if you don't have a plan in place, what are some of the things you might do? Well, I think the impact of COVID-19 is a great way to collect data. It's a great way to take an opportunity to look at your internal strengths and weaknesses and answer some of these questions, like, what values are evident in our response, for better or worse? What systems do we have that work or don't work in a crisis situation or in challenges? Do we have adequate reserve funds? I did several consulting projects with foundations where one of the questions on the RFPs were asking people for the level of reserve funds that they had. And it was really, really scary to see how many organizations, the majority of organizations, did not have a lot of reserve funds. Another question is, how's your board responding here? If you're a board member or if you're a CEO, this is a great opportunity for the board to step up. And actually in the resources, one of the things we have is an article about how a lot of nonprofit boards are stepping up right now. But this could be an opportunity to take a look at, are there changes that need to be made in your governance structure? And where is the opportunity here to deepen relationships between the board and the staff? Another thing is, are you able to rethink the way that you deliver programs? Which some of you are being forced to do. And certainly if you're one of those responder organizations, you're probably being challenged to rethink how you deliver services. And that in some of that downtime, when someone mentioned earlier about one of the ways that they're getting through this is by slowing down, that could be time to vision the future, because the future will come. That's the other thing to remember, is that we are in the midst of crisis. We don't know when it's going to end, and we don't know what the world is going to look like beyond this, but we do know that there's going to be a future. That's a certainty. But what is that future going to look like for you, for your organization? And this is a great opportunity maybe to start thinking about that. Another tool that we're offering in the resources are some tips on how to conduct virtual meetings. So when you maybe pull together some folks, board and staff, to think about the future, it can also be helpful, I think, to step back from the immediate crisis intervention, if we can, to the degree that it's possible, and think about the future and what do we want the future to look like? Because that's the first step in any strategic planning process, is visioning the future. It's that sort of conceptual stage of strategic planning where we think about what do we want to be? What change do we want to be? What change do we want to impact in the future? What do we want the world to look like as a result of our efforts at some point down the line, 5 years from now or more? Well, these are some of the things that you might consider doing that when this is over and you're ready to start strategic planning, you'll already have a lot of your data in place as it relates to your internal processes. The other side of strengths and weaknesses are the opportunities and threats, and that's what's happening in the external environment. And we certainly know that one of the major threats is the change in the funding environment, the changes that are coming. But also, what are the opportunities out there? But we may be able to see some of those in how you are rethinking programs. They may be opportunities. Other organizations that are not able to weather this and maybe present opportunities to merge or acquire programs or expand. But what's happening externally is something we have no control over. Whereas internally, strengths and weaknesses, we have some modicum of control over these. So it's a good place to start. I love this quote. That the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. And finally, don't be afraid to try new things. So we're doing pretty well in terms of time. We're going to move to Q&A in just a minute. So first, I'd just like to talk about some of the resources that we've mentioned. The Nonprofit Finance Fund. We'll send this out to everybody afterwards, so don't try to scramble to write these things down. The Nonprofit Finance Fund is offering insights, how-to videos, those tools I mentioned about modifying cash flow, budget scenarios, other finance-related tools. Very helpful. Sea Change Capital, that decision-making framework. The Association of Fundraising Professionals, which as many of you probably know, is a national organization with lots of local chapters. They're producing a lot of material around fundraising during COVID-19. The National Council of Nonprofits, great resource. They've got videos, they've got articles. They really are monitoring what's happening nationally and as always, developing and sharing best practices. Bridgespan is a great organization, and they're providing resources for both nonprofits and for philanthropy, for funders. Candid, which is the relatively newly formed organization out of the Foundation Center, and GuideStar, they're tracking philanthropy's response. So if you want to see what philanthropy is doing either for your cause or for your region, that can be a great resource. Scranton Area Community Foundation, they have their COVID-19 Relief Fund. Maggie, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so we are continuing to receive the requests in through the shared site, which is being co-sponsored with NEPA grant makers. So when you submit into there, you're applying not only to the Scranton Area Foundation COVID-19 Relief Fund, but you're also applying into Luzerne counties and Moses Taylor foundations. We have a lot of other foundations that are serving as advisors as well. So we tried to make it as simple as possible for people to apply. We tried to make the application simplified. We do think that it is helpful, as much detail as you can provide within the questions that we do ask. And we are, I know each of us, each funder is kind of handling the requests differently as we kind of sift through all the applications. We've received over 70 applications in so far. As much as we continue to grow our resources, the need will exceed our resources, but we're still going to do our best to make sure it's shared out equitably. But the more information that you're able to give us about how the funding is used and how the support is needed right now and demonstrate that, the better we're able to make a decision to make sure we're splitting up our funds as equitably as possible. So.
Great. And I think it's an example of how philanthropy is stepping up. And I know for anyone who survived the when the economy crashed in 2008, philanthropy was definitely impacted because a lot of the giving is based on resources that are invested. And as investments, certainly today, are shifting, the resources are shifting. But philanthropy traditionally steps up. And another thing to remember, I think, is interesting fact, that individual giving tends to go up in a crisis. Now, again, this is unprecedented. I think the last number I saw is that 20 million Americans have applied for unemployment. And you can consider there's probably more folks who haven't because they can't. But that's a lot. That's more people out of work, or the most people out of work since the Great Depression in the 1930s. So it's a huge change in the world, but people tend to give when there is a crisis. So don't be afraid to ask for money. People will give if they can, and they won't if they can't, but they won't if you don't ask. So thinking about how to ask for money in this is, well, I think one of the things in the certainly in the Association of Fundraising Professionals resources. And the next item here is an article from Cause Effective. This is the one I mentioned about how nonprofit boards are stepping up. Cause Effective, for those who may not be familiar with them, it's a New York City-based organization, and their focus is on mid-sized organizations and helping them with fundraising and board development with an eye towards board fundraising. So there's other resources at their website. And there's also an article there about being strategic versus tactical in a crisis. That naturally, crisis hits, the first thing we start to do is looking at our tactical response. But what they talk about in the article and what we're talking about today is, yes, deal with the tactical, absolutely, but don't lose sight of the strategic. And that's where that important versus urgent can be really helpful, because the tactical is urgent, most likely, but the important is being strategic and continuing to vision for the future and thinking bigger picture rather than small immediate response. I don't mean small, but I just mean immediate response. Or I mean, take back to small. Nothing anybody's doing today is small on any scale, given the level of challenge that we're all dealing with right now. And then we have tips for virtual meetings. This was a helpful article, particularly for, it's aimed towards boards. As board members can't meet in person, and they still need to meet. There's tips for virtual meetings and how to make them impactful, successful. But I think the tips there apply to staff meetings, any kind of meeting, really, that's virtual. And all of these resources up to this point are free. So feel free to reach out. And it's by no means comprehensive. I don't know about you, but every day I get lots of emails in my inbox with this organization's response, this situation's response. It's a little overwhelming. And I look through with, which of these are neither urgent nor important, and delete. And some of them are like, oh, this is great to know. And then finally, we have Adobe Connect. We're using Zoom right now. There are people who have concerns about some security issues in using Zoom. People have been using GoToMeetings. I was on something called Blue Jeans the other day, which was, may have been me. But Adobe Connect costs, but it's certified. So if you're an organization that has HIPAA regulations or other kind of federal regulations, you take a look at this website and it'll tell you what it would cost to use Adobe Connect and where they're certified. from different regulators. And I think the least expensive option, you get, I think, a 2-week free trial, and then there's a 1-month lower level trial for only $50. So those are things that might be helpful. So we're going to move now to Q&A. We have about maybe 15, almost 18 minutes to answer some questions. And if you don't have a question, but you have a resource to share, we'd like to hear from you about that also. So with that, I'm going to open it up. And Maggie, we're going to, will people be able to unmute and ask their question, or are we going to ask them to do it through the chat? I'm sending it back to you.
Both, yeah. So it's kind of whatever everyone's comfortable with. There is the Q&A box. As you get, if you scroll over along the bottom, there's Q&A. That's usually the best way to go through and answer your questions. If you want to speak, or you have, certainly feel free to raise your hand, and I can unmute you. Or if you're most comfortable with chat, go with that. So any way you want to get your question or thought or resource through, feel free to use those features. As those are coming through, there was a question, if you can help provide an example of something that might be considered urgent but not important.
I have to think about that. Can I circle back to that? I don't have one off the top of my head. I'm trying to think of one, and I know I have them, but it's not coming up immediately. Does anybody else have an answer for that to share?
I know, I could speak personally on that, while other people, take the time to send in their questions. I know, I've gotten quite a lot of that. We're doing our best from the foundation perspective to mount a quick and thorough response for our nonprofits. So it's a daily challenge for me to kind of make sure that I'm addressing the emails in my inbox that have highest importance, and try to get back to people quickly, and doing my very best to make that happen. There are certain things that are urgent because of making sure that we mount those quick response, but trying to determine what is the important versus urgent is really a big challenge. I know for me personally, is making sure even though somebody might need me as they feel maybe urgently, when it's compared to the grand scheme of everything that has to get done, have to determine that importance level. So, and I do also have a question as well for you, Frank, while the questions are coming in. What is the challenge? I know that, dealing with board members, there might be some board members on this call. So, but, when you're speaking with your board, how do you kind of convey the importance of not losing sight of the value behind what you're doing, and not to slip quickly into that panic mode, but still, staying on course? How do you relay that to your board members, would you suggest?
Well, I think some of the things people mentioned earlier could be helpful, certainly about communication, transparency, honesty. I think the one thought is that we often talk about boards as if they're this monolithic entity, and they're not. They are a corporate entity, a legal entity, but they're a collection of individuals. So in an ideal situation, pre, during, or post-crisis, the key relationship is between the chief executive officer, ED, CEO, president, and the board chair. So if you're getting pressure from the board, or the board is getting distracted, or you want to keep the board on track, ideally, you as the CEO are not responsible for leading the board. The board chair is responsible for leading the board. So getting the board chair, having that conversation with the board chair one-on-one to identify how the board needs to move forward, and then having that come from the board chair or other leaders on the board, maybe speaking collectively as an executive committee, that rather than try to address everybody all at once as the CEO, communicate with the board chair, have the board chair communicate with the board and provide leadership there. Does that answer the question? I'm not 100% sure that I have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's just important, you know, as we are getting our communications out, making sure, you know, try to make sure everybody's on the same team, so to speak, and on the same level. So that does help.
Well,
Ryan,
actually, it brings up one possible example of something that's urgent but not important, is getting calls or emails from board members who are demanding attention around a particular issue that you can see in the moment is not something, you know, they're approaching you with a great deal of urgency, but you can look at it and say, this is not an important issue right now. I have to deal with other things. This is not what's important. You know, what are we going to do about the flowers we had booked for our gala, which we're not going to have anymore? And I need to get back to somebody about XYZ or something that feels to someone else urgent, but to you, you don't have the time for that because it's not immediately important. It's not the best example, but it's the one that just popped up.
yeah, and Ryan kind of echoes that. She commented that sometimes the item is timely and important to somebody else, but in your own life, it's not nearly as
Great
important.
point.
And but it still needs to be done timely because you don't want to dismiss. Don't always want to dismiss, right, what the other person finds urgently, but it's, I guess, balancing others' needs versus your own.
Right. That's an excellent point. And that was Ryan. Is that Ryan from Wayne County?
Yeah.
Great point. Yes, that a lot of that urgency is coming at you from other people, and being able to manage that respectfully, but clearly and firmly is important. Great.
So yeah, so still waiting on a few other questions. As mentioned, you could put it into the Q&A, or you could put it into the chat, or raise your hand if you want. I'm wondering, you know, when it comes to people's strategic plans, you know, they've taken the time to develop these with their board. Obviously, the board has, you know, a lot of importance in passing these strategic plans, but, you know, do you throw them out? Do you reassess them? What is your advice on, you know, if you're in the middle or just begun a strategic plan?
Excuse my dry cough. It's not COVID. I think it's just allergies. So I think if you're just beginning a strategic plan, if you haven't gone through the process, you might take a step back and think about, okay, well, what part of this is doable, valid, given the situation that we're in. So when I think about strategic planning, I think about it in 3 phases. So there's the first phase where you are visioning the future. There's the second phase where which ends with the first phase, ends with, you know, what data do we need in order to inform our planning. So that second phase is about gathering data, analyzing it, and looking at what does that data tell us about who we are, how we operate, and the world we operate in. And then the third phase is operationalizing all of that into something more detailed and structured and integrated into the organization's DNA. But that first conceptual phase, if you're still in that, at this point, yeah, you can still vision about the future. That's something that can take you out of today and into tomorrow. That could be helpful. But if you're just beginning your sort of data collection phase, you might want to put a hold on that. A lot of data collection is about talking to your whole wide range of stakeholders, strategic partners, funders, other folks that you impact or deal with externally. And they may be very distracted right now and they don't know what their future looks like. So I don't think it's particularly helpful to try to engage in a lot of data collection right now. If you have gone through and you've got your vision for the future, you've set goals and objectives, the board has approved the plan, and now it's time to operationalize it. Certainly think about it in relation to what's happening today. Does that make sense? Or is it time to hit the pause on that? That's the other thing. There's a middle ground between jettisoning everything you've already done, all that work that's already happened, and trying to plow through nonetheless. That you can hit pause. That's a valid response right now. Does that answer the question?
I think so. And we have a couple other questions that have come in.
Sure.
So
What do we got?
So Peg Kopko says, what about organizations that are struggling and maybe need to have those collaborative conversations? Where do the organizations begin?
That's a great question. Well, I think it starts with, again, honestly, transparency. Those conversations about, are we going to close? Are we going to sunset here? We just cannot continue. There's just no way. That's a question for the board, because ultimately it is the board's organization. They are responsible for it. So the first conversations happens with the CEO and the board. And then it's the board's responsibility to think about, if we are going to need to sunset, how are we going to do that thoughtfully and appropriately, and what resources do we need to help us through that? If the organization is struggling and they could turn to a funder, they could turn to United Way, they could turn to Scranton Area Community Foundation and say, listen, we're struggling. We don't know that we're going to survive this. The funder has that larger sort of 30,000-foot view of what's happening in the community, maybe a broader perspective than the individual organization might have. So you might turn to your funder and say, do you know anybody else who's struggling? Do you know anybody else who's maybe not struggling, who's handling this okay, that we might talk with? Do you know of anybody who might be open to having a conversation with us right now? And then if there is, the conversations are initially, I think, discreet between maybe CEOs with each other, and maybe two CEOs and two board chairs coming together to have a conversation about that. That's at a sort of merger anticipation, closure anticipation level. If it's not that dire, and that process, that movement is not necessarily dire. If it's more about, we need somebody who can pick up this piece of our programming, which we can no longer handle, then again, if you have a strategic plan in place, you've already identified who else in the community is doing similar work. If you don't have a plan in place, again, you can go to funders, you can go to colleagues, and look at who else is providing, who's serving the same population, and are there introductions that could happen through the funder, or a discrete outreach to another, from one CEO to another.
Those are great points.
The things that Sea Change Capital, they have a thing called the Lodestar Fund where they actually, in pre-COVID days, would have paid for dinner for CEOs and board chairs to talk about, have that conversation. So they may have other virtual resources available now.
Those are great points, and I know you know, as a representative of Scranton Area Community Foundation, we're certainly always welcome to, you know, help make those connections. Sister Ann kind of echoes that. She says there can be a lot of power in merging organizations that have some overlapping service commitments. Board members can be incorporated to assure mission awareness and values of service commitments. You know, merging these constituency groups is a very valuable thing. So she does echo exactly what you said.
Right.
I've had a couple
I think
of other.
the big,
Oh,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
I just want to make one point that the big question when you think about merger is, are we advancing our mission or are we preserving an organization? What's happening here? And if our commitment is to advancing our mission, then sometimes it's challenging, but we need to take ourselves out of the mix and look at how do we continue to ensure that the people who need the services are going to continue to get them. Certainly if we can't do it.
That's a really great point, Frank. Thank you. So Maria Wilson has a two-part question, really. She said, this is like building a plane and having to fly it at the same time. This is a great analogy. She says, how do you not feel overwhelmed? She references the Eisenhower plan. She also asks, you know, job descriptions are likely to change. How do you transition staff to a new business model if there is one? It's kind of a two-part question.
Right. Well, I think the not being overwhelmed, first things first, is self-care. You know, taking care of yourself, giving yourself room to breathe, to drop your shoulders a bit. Someone mentioned exercise before. Other things that might be helpful are just breathing, just, you know, learning to take some deep breaths, and that can, 3 deep breaths can sometimes shift your whole perspective on something. So there's lots of techniques out there for dealing with overwhelm. Introducing new practices like learning how to meditate right now, while a great tool, may not be completely feasible, but I think looking for how are you taking care of yourself first, and then for the second part, those are going to be hard conversations to have. Some very, very hard conversations. Actually, not on the list of resources, but there's a book called Having the Crucial Conversation, which can be helpful in having challenging conversations. But something, compassion, transparency. If we're going to continue to serve the people that we've made a commitment to and honor those people who've contributed to us in time and talent, we need to develop a new business model. And unfortunately, it's going to mean a reduction in staff. And I wouldn't make that announcement until you're ready to do that, or you have a plan in place for that. People are scared enough to throw that out as a possibility right now when you don't have a plan in place. It's just going to contribute to people's fear and anxiety and uncertainty. So I would wait until you're clear about what that new business model is before you start communicating challenges to people. And if people are going to have to work differently or do different things, you know, some of the choice is going to be up to them about whether they're able to do that or not. Your job as the CEO is to determine what is the feasible business model, what is the best structure, and that structure is determined by what the need is and how to be efficient and effective versus, well, we can't get rid of so-and-so because they've been with us for so long, or we can't get rid of this one or that one for personal reasons. Sometimes you got to make the hard decisions. Yeah. I don't know if that answers it or not.
Great points. So there are 2 more questions.
Okay.
We're nearing the end, but I certainly, I know you don't have a problem with, you know, extending a little bit if need be. Maria did say yes, thank you to answer your question.
Sure.
So, but yeah, so we'll answer these 2 questions, and we understand if others have to hop off. As I said, this will be recorded. But so the next question is from Ryan Jennings. She said, our foundation generally sends out our annual appeal in the summer months that they're on a fiscal cycle. What are your thoughts, or what are you hearing as far as advice for planned giving, as far as appeals, not necessarily legacy gifts, and the timing of those? the board is hesitant to send out anything, and I want to have a strategy for timing, and I know how important it is to still ask.
Wow, that's a big question. And I don't know that I'm fully qualified to answer that, Ryan. Who I'm happy to offline maybe have a conversation and or offer connections to people that are better suited to answer that. So certainly plan giving. I had a colleague the other day who had received a call from somebody, and it was implied somehow that you're one of our legacy donors and you're in the high risk category. So do you want to make your commitment now before you die, basically? So I'd be real careful about how I ask for anything related to planned giving or legacy gifts right now. But you do have to continue to work, and you do have to continue to ask. And what you might consider is, to the degree that you can, project ahead to, when you talk about summer, are you talking about June? Are you talking about July, August? How far out from now? And could you maybe develop a couple of appeal letters that project different scenarios? So the economy is fully, not the economy is fully back, but people are out of lockdown and back working again by June. That may be one scenario. People are still in lockdown. That's another scenario. But again, I'm not a fundraising expert. So I think that's something that I would look at the FP website, see if they have anything to offer there. And I can certainly share offline some contacts with other consultants I know who do fundraising and planned giving.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, and Ryan chatted back. It's fine that they can have an offline conversation, shared or emails. So we'll make sure you guys are able to connect. Before I get to the last question, John Farkas did share, he said there is a great website called Calm to help everyone deal with the current stressful situation. Provides a source of stories, music, breathing, exercises, visual images, all of which is free. So
Is that calm.org or calm.com?
He said it's a great website called Calm. I don't have the website address.
Okay.
But it's definitely, a resource I wanted to share out there. Oh, calm.org, he believes. So,
great.
Great.
I'll look at that. That sounds great. Thank you.
And so the last question that I have here is from Paula Bailey, and she asks, how is it possible to plan for reopening all of our programs when we do not know what governmental restrictions will be placed upon group gatherings? Essentially, what's the baseline for planning?
Right. Well, I think you're right. You don't know. You don't know. So it's not possible to plan ahead with any certainty, which is why I think planning ahead with various scenarios is helpful. So taking a look at, well, all right, if we are largely government funded and we can anticipate that there's going to be cuts. The government's handing out money right now. It's spending trillions of dollars. That money is going to have to come from somewhere. And it's very likely that human services, support for arts, culture, all the things that the government currently supports, that's probably one of the first places where they're going to look to cut and to have some savings. So I think it would be helpful to look ahead at 30% cuts, 50% cuts, 60% cuts, and what does that mean in terms of what we can offer, and have multiple plans based on various scenarios. And that's something you can do right now. And then once you start to see what kind of cuts are coming or what the impact's going to be on you particularly, you can go to those plans and say, okay, let's put plan B 45% cut into play right now.
Great.
That's not a definitive answer, but I don't know that there is one right now.
Yeah, I think you're right, Frank. I don't know, there continues to be a lot of unknowns, a lot of challenges with knowing the right resources. So But I'm very appreciative of your time. That is all the questions that we have received. So I just want to thank you again for your time today. As there's other, I'm not sure if you have any other wrap up information you wanted to include.
No, I just wanted to take a look at what we set out to do. We only had an hour, so we wanted to share some lessons learned. We wanted to identify techniques for prioritizing in the current crisis. We wanted to discuss how to approach strategic planning and future visioning. We wanted to share some resources. So I think we've done okay. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Maggie, to see if there's anything you'd like to say in closing. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I appreciate it. And I wish everybody all the best in this situation. It's not easy for any of us, but we have a remarkable community. And I think that was something that somebody else brought up earlier too, and how they're managing through this is that group thinking and looking to the community for support. And I think what Scranton Area Community Foundation, community is the key word there right now. So
Right.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Frank. We're going to continue to try to provide as many resources that we can to our community. Of course, we're working on the COVID funds to be able to deploy some grant dollars, but even beyond that, we want to be able to be a resource. So that's why, we've been having weekly webinars, so that we could help provide this information. And if there's other things that we can do as a foundation, please, feel free to reach out. As we mentioned, between the urgent and important conversation, if I'm not getting back to you immediately, just be patient. We will try to respond, but we want to be here to continue to help be a resource for our organizations, for all of our nonprofit partners. So, so we're thankful to you for your time. If people have questions or want to reach out, are you okay with me sharing your contact information, Frank?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, I don't know that we decided that we were going to share the slide deck with folks.
Yes, yep, I will be sharing that out, yep,
Great.
with everybody.
Which has all the links and the resource links in it.
Yep, they'll get that, and they'll also get a copy of the recording from today's presentation. So,
Oh, great. Okay.
And John did clarify it is com.com. So it is CALM.com. So, as we wrap up another week in social isolation, get up those resources because, this is challenging times, and all we could do is try to take care of each other, right? And ourselves and each other. So.
Mm-hmm. And this too will pass.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. Well, thank you again, Frank, and thank you all for participating today. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Hopefully we get some nice warm weather to enjoy the outside. Stay safe, everyone.
All right, you too. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.